When the great flood covered the mountains, when the waters rose to the heavens, when humanity was erased from the earth, only Ziusudra remained, the exceeding wise who sought eternal life. He was told by Enki the secrets that the gods had hidden, the knowledge of those who came before, the truth of the 6 humanities that perished before our own. What was revealed to him? The tablet's record. But humanity forgot. Are we truly the first advanced civilization to walk this planet? Could 6 others have risen and fallen before us, erased by catastrophes so complete that barely a trace remains? What if the Sumerian tablets, the oldest written records in human history, contain not mythology but memory, not fantasy but fact, a warning encoded in clay that we were never meant to forget? These questions have haunted researchers, archaeologists, and alternative historians for decades. The answers, if they exist, lie buried in thousands of cuneiform tablets unearthed from the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, tablets that speak of cycles of creation and destruction, of humanities created and annihilated, of gods who walked among men and made decisions about our very existence. What we are about to explore challenges everything you learned in history class, everything the mainstream narrative tells us about human origins and the timeline of civilization. But before we dive into these controversial waters, let us remember what Aristotle once said. It is the mark of an educated mind to entertain a thought without accepting it. What follows are propositions that remain highly controversial in academic circles, interpretations that deviate from conventional archaeology and anthropology. We present multiple perspectives, from traditional scholarship to alternative theories, and we encourage you to examine the evidence and draw your own conclusions. This is not about absolute truth, but about asking questions that perhaps should have been asked long ago. The story begins in the ruins of ancient Sumer, in what is now modern-day Iraq, where archaeologists in the mid-19th century began unearthing something extraordinary. Beneath the desert sands, they found the remnants of cities that dated back more than 5,000 years, cities with advanced systems of governance, mathematics, astronomy, and writing. The cuneiform script they discovered was unlike anything seen before, pressed into clay tablets by scribes who recorded everything from administrative records to epic poetry, from astronomical observations to what they called messages from the gods. Among these thousands of tablets, certain texts stood out, texts that seemed to describe not just the history of Sumer, but the history of the world itself, a history that extended far beyond what conventional chronology allowed. These were the creation myths, the flood narratives, the king lists that recorded reigns lasting thousands of years, and most intriguingly, references to previous worlds, previous humanities, previous ages that had come and gone. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest creation accounts ever discovered, speaks of the creation of mankind, but also hints at destructions, at decisions made by the gods to wipe the slate clean and start again. The Sumerian King List, a document that has baffled scholars since its discovery, records kings who ruled for impossibly long periods before a great flood, and then much shorter reigns afterward. It divides history into 2 distinct periods, before the flood and after the flood. But here is where it becomes truly mysterious. Some interpretations of these texts suggest that the flood mentioned was not the first catastrophe, that there had been others before it, that humanity as we know it might be the latest in a series of experiments, the 7th attempt at creating a species capable of consciousness, civilization, and perhaps something more. Zecharia Sitchin, the controversial scholar and author who spent decades translating and interpreting Sumerian texts, proposed a radical theory. He argued that these ancient tablets were not mythological allegories, but literal historical records, that the gods of Sumer, the Anunnaki, were not supernatural beings but extraterrestrial visitors who came to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago and genetically engineered humanity to serve as a workforce. According to Sitchin's translations, these beings created several versions of humanity, each more advanced than the last, and each ultimately destroyed when the experiment failed or when natural catastrophes intervened. His work, based on his interpretation of cuneiform texts and his understanding of Sumerian cosmology, suggests that we are the 7th and current version of humanity, the survivors of a long lineage of civilizations that rose, flourished, and vanished, leaving behind only fragments of their existence in the mythological memories of their descendants. Mainstream academics dismiss Sitchin's translations as fundamentally flawed, arguing that his understanding of Sumerian grammar and context was incorrect, that he read meanings into texts that were never there, and that his theories contradict everything we know about human evolution and the archaeological record. But despite these criticisms, Sitchin's work has inspired millions to question the conventional narrative, to look at ancient texts with fresh eyes, and to wonder if perhaps there is more to our history than we have been told. Could there be truth hidden in these ancient stories? Could the gods of mythology have been visitors from the stars? And if so, what does that mean for us, the seventh humanity, living in an age of technology that is beginning to rival what the ancients described? But before we explore the alternative interpretation, we must first understand what mainstream scholarship says about these texts, what conventional archaeology and anthropology teach us about the Sumerians and their creation myths. The Sumerians emerged in southern Mesopotamia around 4500 BCE, developing one of the world's first urban civilizations in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They built cities like Uruk, Ur, Eridu, and Lagash, each with massive ziggurats, complex irrigation systems, and populations numbering in the tens of thousands. They invented writing around 3200 BCE, initially as a means of recording economic transactions, but gradually expanding to include literature, law, science, and religion. Their creation myths, like the Enuma Elish and the Eridu Genesis, follow patterns familiar to scholars of comparative mythology, stories of gods creating order from chaos, of divine beings fashioning humanity from clay or blood, of great floods sent to punish or purify the world. These narratives, according to mainstream interpretation, are theological and philosophical texts meant to explain the human condition, the relationship between mortals and the divine, the origins of suffering, and the meaning of existence. They are not meant to be read as literal history, but as sacred stories that convey deeper truths about the human experience. The gods in these stories, such as Anu, Enlil, Enki, and Inanna, represent natural forces and cosmic principles, personifications of the sky, the wind, the waters, and the cycles of life and death. When these texts speak of multiple creations and destructions, mainstream scholars interpret them as mythological expressions of observed natural cycles, the changing of seasons, the flooding of rivers, the rise and fall of dynasties. The idea that these texts record actual events involving non-human intelligences, according to this view, is a misunderstanding born from taking metaphor as literal fact. Yet there are aspects of these texts that have puzzled even conventional scholars, details that do not fit neatly into the mythological framework, descriptions that seem oddly specific, references to knowledge that the Sumerians theoretically should not have possessed. The Sumerian king list, for example, presents a chronological problem that has never been satisfactorily resolved. It lists 8 kings who ruled before the flood, with reigns lasting from 800 to 200 years each. After the flood, the reigns become shorter but still impossibly long by human standards, gradually decreasing over time until they reach lengths that seem more historically plausible. Mainstream scholars explain this as a common mythological trope, the idea of a golden age when humans lived longer and gods walked among mortals, gradually giving way to the diminished present. But why record it in the form of a king list, a document type that in all other cases is meant to be a straightforward historical record? Why present it alongside later kings whose reigns are documented in other sources and whose historicity is not disputed? Could there be another explanation? One that takes the text more seriously as an attempt to record actual chronology, even if that chronology extends beyond what we currently consider possible. There is one detail that becomes crucial to this entire investigation, a detail we will return to later when we examine what the tablets say about the purpose of humanity's creation. This detail changes everything about how we interpret these ancient records. But first we must lay more groundwork, explore more of what these texts actually say, and understand the full scope of the claims being made. The Eridu Genesis, also known as the Sumerian creation myth, is one of the oldest narrative texts ever discovered, dating to approximately 2300 BCE, but likely based on much older oral traditions. It describes the creation of humanity by the gods, specifically by Enki and the goddess Ninmah, who fashioned humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god. The text states that humanity was created to serve the gods, to take over the laborious tasks that the minor gods, the Igigi, had been performing and had grown weary of. Humans were to cultivate the land, dig the canals, build the temples, and provide offerings to sustain the divine hierarchy. This narrative is echoed in the later Babylonian Atrahasis epic, which provides even more detail about the creation process and the reasons behind it. According to Atrahasis, the Igigi had been working for 40 years digging rivers and canals, and they finally rebelled, laying down their tools and marching to the house of Enlil, the chief god, demanding an end to their toil. The gods held a council and decided to create a new species that would take over these tasks, allowing the Igigi to rest. Enki proposed creating humans by mixing clay with the flesh and blood of a slain god, specifically a god named We'ila, or Geshtu-i, who possessed intelligence. The goddess Nintu, the birth goddess, performed the act of creation, mixing the divine blood with clay and shaping it into human form. But here is where things become interesting from an alternative perspective. The text describes a deliberate act of genetic engineering, the mixing of divine essence, which Sitchin and others interpret as extraterrestrial DNA, with terrestrial clay, which they interpret as primitive hominid genetic material. The result was a hybrid being, intelligent enough to understand complex instructions and perform sophisticated tasks, but mortal and limited in ways that the gods were not. Could this be an ancient description of genetic manipulation? Could the Sumerian scribes have been recording, in the only language and conceptual framework available to them, a scientific procedure performed by advanced beings? The text continues with descriptions of the early days of humanity, when humans multiplied rapidly and spread across the land. But then, according to multiple Sumerian and Babylonian sources, something went wrong. Humanity became too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive to the gods' peace. The Atrahasis epic states explicitly that the gods decided to reduce the human population through various means, first plague, then drought, then famine. But each time Enki, who had created humanity and had developed an affection for his creation, warned the humans and helped them survive. Finally, the gods decided on a more permanent solution, a great flood that would wipe out all of humanity. Enlil, the chief god, bound the other gods by oath not to warn humanity of the coming catastrophe. But Enki found a loophole. He could not speak directly to a human, so instead he spoke to the wall of a reed house, where a man named Atrahasis happened to be listening. Enki instructed Atrahasis to build a boat, to seal it with bitumen, to bring aboard his family and examples of all living creatures. The flood came, lasting 7 days and 7 nights, and when it subsided, only Atrahasis and those in his boat survived. The gods, seeing that humanity had been preserved, were divided. Enlil was furious that his plan had been thwarted, while other gods were relieved, having realized that they actually needed humans to provide offerings and maintain the temples. A compromise was reached. Humanity would be allowed to continue, but with new limitations imposed, including mortality, infertility for some, and the introduction of predators and disease to keep the population in check. This is the standard narrative found in the texts, the story as mainstream scholars understand it. But there are elements here that invite deeper questions. Why would gods, supposedly all-powerful spiritual beings, need humans to dig canals and build temples? Why would they be bothered by noise? Why would they require food offerings? Unless, as alternative theorists suggest, these were not gods in the supernatural sense, but physical beings with physical needs and limitations. Beings who had come to Earth for a specific purpose and who created humans as a biological solution to a labor problem. Now here is where we encounter the first of several pieces of evidence that will weave through our entire investigation. The text mentions that this was not the first time humanity faced near extinction, that there had been earlier catastrophes, earlier attempts at controlling or eliminating the human population, and some interpretations suggest that there were earlier versions of humanity altogether, versions that did not survive or that were deliberately replaced. The Sumerian texts speak of multiple creations, of gods creating and recreating, of worlds that existed before the current world order. The Eridu Genesis itself begins with the line, "When kingship descended from heaven," referring to a time before the current age, implying previous ages that had passed. The concept of cyclical time, of worlds that are created and destroyed in endless succession, is found not only in Sumerian literature, but also in the mythologies of cultures around the world, from the Hindu concept of yugas to the Aztec belief in 5 suns, each representing an age of the world that ended in catastrophe. Could these traditions be preserving a memory of actual cyclic cataclysms that have reset civilization multiple times? Could our current civilization be merely the latest in a long series, the 7th according to some interpretations, destined perhaps to meet the same fate as those that came before unless we learn the lessons encoded in these ancient warnings? As we continue our investigation, this will be one of the central mysteries we must unravel. What exactly do the texts mean when they refer to previous worlds, previous humanities, and what evidence might exist that such civilizations actually rose and fell in the deep past? Zecharia Sitchin's interpretation of these texts rests on several key premises. First, he argued that the Sumerian word Anunnaki, commonly translated as those of royal blood or princely offspring, actually means those who from heaven to earth came, indicating that these beings were extraterrestrial visitors. Second, he proposed that the Sumerians possessed advanced astronomical knowledge that they could not have developed on their own, knowledge that must have been given to them by these visitors. Third, he suggested that many of the stories in Sumerian texts describe advanced technology, flying vehicles described as divine birds or celestial boats, weapons described as divine thunderbolts that could level mountains, and procedures described as divine magic that could create life or extend it far beyond normal human spans. Fourth, and most controversially, he proposed that the Anunnaki came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago in search of gold, which they needed to repair their planet's deteriorating atmosphere, a problem he associated with the Mesopotamian term, heaven that is cracking. According to Sitchin, the Anunnaki initially mined the gold themselves, but after a rebellion by the worker class, they decided to create a primitive worker through genetic engineering, mixing their own DNA with that of Homo erectus, the hominid species that existed on Earth at that time. This created Homo sapiens, modern humans, approximately 300,000 years ago, matching roughly with what genetic and fossil evidence suggests for the emergence of anatomically modern humans. Over time, according to this theory, the Anunnaki continued to refine their creation, producing several versions or generations of humanity, each more advanced than the previous one, and each eventually destroyed either by natural catastrophes or by deliberate action when the experiment went awry. The academic response to Sitchin's work has been overwhelmingly negative. Scholars who specialize in Sumerian language and culture have pointed out numerous errors in his translations, arguing that he frequently mistranslated words, ignored grammatical context, and imposed meanings on texts that were not supported by the actual cuneiform signs. For example, his translation of Anunnaki as those who from heaven to earth came is not supported by the linguistic evidence. The word more accurately means offspring of An, referring to the god An or Anu, the sky god who was considered the father of many deities in the Sumerian pantheon. His claims about Sumerian astronomical knowledge have also been challenged. While the Sumerians were indeed sophisticated astronomers who tracked the movements of planets and stars with remarkable precision, there is no evidence that they knew about planets beyond Saturn, which is visible to the naked eye despite Sitchin's claims that they described a complete solar system, including planets that can only be seen with telescopes. His interpretation of Sumerian technology descriptions as references to spacecraft and advanced weaponry is seen by mainstream scholars as a projection of modern concepts onto ancient symbolic and poetic language. When the texts speak of gods descending in celestial boats, conventional interpretation sees this as religious imagery meant to convey divine authority and power, not literal descriptions of physical vehicles. Yet for all the valid criticisms of Sitchin's linguistic methodology, his core proposition continues to resonate with millions of readers around the world. The idea that something is missing from our understanding of human origins, that the conventional narrative of a linear progression from primitive to advanced is too simple, that ancient texts may contain kernels of historical truth buried beneath layers of mythological elaboration, and that we should at least be open to the possibility that our ancestors were describing real events and real beings, even if we must reinterpret what they wrote in light of modern knowledge. One of the most compelling aspects of Sitchin's theory, and one reason it has gained such a following despite academic rejection, is that it offers explanations for anomalies that conventional archaeology struggles to address. Why did civilization appear so suddenly in Sumer around 3500 BCE, with seemingly no gradual development? Why did the Sumerians possess knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering that seems disproportionate to their supposed level of development? Why are there so many similarities between Sumerian myths and the myths of cultures that had no known contact with Mesopotamia, such as the Maya, the Inca, and even cultures in the Pacific Islands? And perhaps most intriguingly, why do ancient texts from around the world describe gods descending from the sky, beings who taught humanity the arts of civilization, who mated with human women producing hybrid offspring, and who eventually departed, promising to return? These are questions that deserve serious consideration, even if the answers proposed by alternative theorists are not accepted by mainstream academia. As we delve deeper into the specific evidence and claims, we will examine each of these questions in turn, presenting what the texts actually say, what mainstream scholarship argues, what alternative interpretations propose, and what physical evidence might exist to support either view. But there is something else we must address, something that goes to the heart of this entire investigation. If the Sumerians really were recording historical events, if there really were previous versions of humanity that rose and fell, where is the evidence? Where are the ruins of these earlier civilizations? How could entire advanced societies vanish so completely that we find almost no trace of them? This is the question we will explore as we move forward, and the answers, when we find them, may be more disturbing than we imagined. The concept of cyclical destruction and rebirth is not unique to Sumerian mythology. It appears in cultures across the globe, often with striking similarities that have led some researchers to suggest a common source, a shared memory of actual events that different cultures remembered and recorded in their own ways. In Hindu cosmology, the universe passes through cycles called kalpas, each lasting 4.32 billion years, within which there are smaller cycles called yugas. Humanity exists within these yugas, experiencing ages of increasing moral and spiritual decline until eventually the cycle ends in destruction and begins anew. The current age, the Kali Yuga, is said to be the final and most degraded age before the cycle resets. According to the ancient Hindu texts, there have been countless previous cycles, countless previous humanities that existed, flourished, and were destroyed, only to be created again in the next cycle. The Mahabharata and the Puranas speak of advanced civilizations in previous yugas that possessed vimanas, flying vehicles capable of traveling great distances, weapons called brahmastra that could level entire armies with fire from the sky, and knowledge of sciences that included genetics, described poetically as beings created through meditation and divine will. Are these merely mythological fantasies, or could they be corrupted memories of actual technologies and events? The parallels with what Sitchin and others claim about Sumerian texts are remarkable. In both traditions, we find descriptions of gods who interact with humans, who possess advanced technology, who create and destroy according to cosmic cycles, and who leave behind knowledge that humans gradually forget or lose. In Mesoamerica, the Aztec tradition speaks of 5 suns, 5 ages of the world, each ending in catastrophe. According to the Aztec calendar stone and various codices, the first sun, the age of jaguars, ended when jaguars devoured humanity. The second sun, the age of wind, ended in hurricanes that transformed survivors into monkeys. The third sun, the age of rain of fire, ended in volcanic eruptions and fire from the sky. The fourth sun, the age of water, ended in a great flood that lasted 52 years, during which mountains were covered and humanity was transformed into fish, except for one couple who survived in a hollow log. We currently live in the fifth sun, the age of earthquake, which, according to prophecy, will end in massive earthquakes that destroy the world. Each of these ages was populated by different versions of humanity, and each time the gods had to create anew, refining their creation based on the failures of the previous age. The Popol Vuh, the creation epic of the Maya, tells a similar story. The gods attempted multiple times to create beings capable of worship and consciousness, first making creatures of mud that dissolved, then beings of wood that lacked souls and were destroyed in a flood, and finally humans of maize who were successful, but had to have their vision clouded so they would not become too much like gods themselves. Again, we see the theme of multiple creations, of gods experimenting with different versions of humanity, of destructions that wipe the slate clean so creation can begin again. Is it simply coincidence that cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years tell such similar stories? Or is there something deeper, a core of historical truth, that all these traditions are attempting to preserve? The Greek tradition also contains echoes of this pattern. Hesiod, in his Works and Days written around 700 BCE, describes 5 ages of man. The Golden Age, when humans lived like gods without toil or sorrow. The Silver Age, when humans became arrogant and refused to honor the gods. The Bronze Age, when humans became violent and destroyed themselves in war. The Heroic Age, when demigods and heroes walked the earth. And finally the Iron Age, our current age, characterized by toil, suffering, and moral decline. Each age was destroyed and replaced by the next, with humanity becoming progressively more distant from the divine. Plato, in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, speaks of advanced civilizations that existed thousands of years before his time, including the famous Atlantis, a technologically sophisticated culture that sank beneath the waves in a single day and night of catastrophe, approximately 9,600 BCE, according to his reckoning. Egyptian priests told Plato's ancestor Solon that there had been many destructions of humanity, both by fire and by flood, and that the Greeks had forgotten their own ancient history because each time civilization was destroyed, only illiterate mountain shepherds survived to restart society, losing all written records and cultural memory. Could Plato have been recording actual information received from Egyptian sources? Egypt claimed a continuous civilization stretching back tens of thousands of years, far beyond what conventional chronology allows. The Turin King List and other Egyptian documents reference dynasties of gods and demigods who ruled before the first human pharaohs, a period they called Zep Tepi, the first time, when Egypt was governed by divine beings who brought the knowledge of civilization. As we examine cultures around the world, this pattern repeats. Australian Aboriginal traditions speak of a dream time, an ancient past when creator beings walked the earth and shaped the world, followed by great floods and fires that changed everything. Native American traditions from various tribes speak of previous worlds that were destroyed, with humanity ascending from lower worlds through emergence places, carrying with them knowledge from earlier ages. Chinese mythology speaks of ages ruled by divine emperors who possessed lifespans of thousands of years and who brought the arts of civilization from heaven. African traditions speak of sky gods who descended and mated with humans, producing lineages of kings with divine blood. Pacific Island cultures speak of the time when gods sailed between islands in great boats and built massive stone structures that later humans could not replicate. In nearly every culture that has preserved ancient mythological traditions, we find some version of this story, an ancient time when gods and humans coexisted, followed by a catastrophe, followed by the present age of diminished humanity. Mainstream anthropology explains this as a universal mythological pattern, an archetypal story that emerges naturally from the human psyche, reflecting our psychological need to imagine a golden age of perfection that was lost, giving meaning to our current suffering and offering hope for eventual restoration. But could there be another explanation? Could these stories preserve genuine memories, passed down through oral tradition for thousands of generations, of actual events that occurred in the deep past, when civilization was periodically reset by catastrophes of such magnitude that almost everything was lost? Let us return now to the Sumerian texts with this global context in mind. If multiple cultures around the world remember previous ages and previous catastrophes, then perhaps the Sumerian claim that we are the latest in a series of humanities should be taken more seriously. The question becomes, what exactly do the Sumerian tablets say about these previous humanities? How many were there? What caused their destruction? And what distinguishes our current civilization from those that came before? As we examine the textual evidence, we must be careful to distinguish between what the texts actually state and what various interpreters have read into them. The Eridu Genesis speaks of humanity being created, multiplying and then facing the flood, but it does not explicitly number previous humanities. The Atrahasis epic describes multiple attempts by the gods to reduce the human population before the flood, but again it does not clearly state that there were previous complete civilizations. So where does the idea of 7 humanities come from? It appears to be an interpretation derived from combining multiple sources and reading between the lines of what the texts say. Some researchers point to the Sumerian concept of 7 sages, the Apkallu, who were sent by Enki before the flood to teach humanity the arts of civilization. These 7 sages are described as semi-divine beings, part human and part divine, or in some texts as fish-like beings who emerged from the sea. After the flood, they were replaced by human sages who carried on their teachings, but with diminished power. The number 7 appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian tradition as a sacred number associated with completeness and perfection. 7 planetary deities, 7 gates of the underworld, 7 tablets of creation. Could the 7 sages represent 7 previous attempts at creating civilized humanity? Another source for the concept of multiple humanities comes from examining the Sumerian king list more carefully, particularly the antediluvian section. Some researchers have noted that the text divides history into distinct periods with different characteristics, and they argue that each period might represent a different version or experiment in human civilization. Before the flood, kings ruled for impossibly long periods, and civilization was under direct divine supervision. After the flood, lifespans decreased but were still superhuman for several generations. Then gradually, over the course of the list, reigns become shorter and more historically plausible until we reach the historical period where we can verify the kings and their accomplishments through other sources. Could this progression represent not just mythology, but a record of how humanity evolved or was developed over time, from an initial version that lived much longer, through several intermediate versions, to the current version with modern human lifespans? This interpretation requires reading the king list as telescoping or compressing vast periods of time, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of years, into a linear narrative that ancient scribes were attempting to preserve from older oral traditions. It also requires accepting that the list might be describing not continuous history, but selected representatives from different eras, with gaps and discontinuities that the text does not make explicit. This is admittedly speculative, and mainstream scholars would argue that we are reading far too much into a text that was never meant to be taken as literal chronology, but rather as a theological statement about the relationship between divine authority and earthly kingship. Yet, there is another angle to consider, one that comes from looking at the physical evidence rather than just the texts. If there really were previous advanced civilizations on Earth, civilizations that reached high levels of development before being destroyed, what would we expect to find, and more importantly, what would we not find? This is where the investigation becomes truly fascinating and, for some, truly disturbing. As we continue, we will explore the evidence for lost civilizations, examining archaeological sites that do not fit the conventional timeline, artifacts that seem to show knowledge that should not have existed at particular periods, and most intriguingly, evidence of catastrophes so massive that they could have wiped entire civilizations from existence, leaving only scattered ruins and mythological memories. But before we do that, we need to understand what mainstream geology and archaeology tell us about Earth's recent history, specifically about the period from the end of the last ice age to the present, because it is in this period, roughly the last 12,000 years, where the most compelling evidence for lost civilizations might be found. The last ice age, known to geologists as the Pleistocene, ended approximately 1700 years ago, marking the boundary with our current epoch, the Holocene. During the Pleistocene, massive ice sheets covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia, with sea levels up to 400 feet lower than they are today because so much water was locked up in glaciers. As the ice melted over a period of several thousand years, coastlines around the world were dramatically reshaped, drowning vast areas of land that had been habitable during the Ice Age. Any civilizations that existed in coastal regions during this period would have been forced to migrate or perish, and their cities and structures would now lie underwater, buried beneath sediment on the continental shelves. Mainstream archaeology maintains that during the Ice Age, humans existed only as hunter-gatherers, living in small nomadic bands without agriculture, architecture, or any of the markers we associate with civilization. According to this view, civilization began only after the Ice Age ended, starting with the Neolithic Revolution around 10,000 BCE, when humans first domesticated plants and animals and began living in permanent settlements. The first cities did not appear until much later, around 3500 BCE in Mesopotamia, and shortly after in Egypt, marking the beginning of the Bronze Age and recorded history. Everything before this is considered prehistory, a time when humans lived simply, without writing, without cities, without the technological and social complexity we associate with advanced culture. But is this view correct? Or could it be a failure of imagination, an assumption based on limited evidence that we have mistaken for comprehensive understanding? In recent decades, discoveries have begun to challenge this conventional timeline, suggesting that the story of human civilization may be far more complex than previously thought. The site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, discovered in the 1990s and excavated over the past 3 decades, has revolutionized our understanding of when humans were capable of monumental architecture. Dated to approximately 9500 BCE, Göbekli Tepe consists of massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circles, some weighing up to 20 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. This site predates the earliest known agriculture in the region by at least 1,000 years, predates pottery by several thousand years, and predates Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years. According to conventional theory, such a site should not exist. Hunter-gatherers were not supposed to have the social organization, the surplus food production, or the motivation to build such structures, yet here it stands, forcing archaeologists to reconsider their assumptions. If humans were building complex ceremonial sites in 9500 BCE, what else might they have been capable of? Could there have been other sites, perhaps even more sophisticated, that we have not yet found because they lie underwater or have been destroyed by the passage of time? Göbekli Tepe suggests that the origins of civilization are far older than we thought, pushing the timeline back thousands of years. But how much further back could it go? Could civilization actually be not 5,000 years old, but 10,000, 20,000, or even older? This is where alternative researchers like Graham Hancock, Robert Schoch, and others have stepped in, arguing for the existence of an advanced maritime civilization that existed during the Ice Age, perhaps as far back as 15,000 to 12,000 BCE, which was destroyed in the catastrophic melting that ended the Pleistocene. They point to underwater structures off the coasts of Japan, India, Cuba, and the Mediterranean that appear to show evidence of human engineering: straight lines, right angles, apparent quarrying marks, structures that seem too regular to be natural formations. While mainstream archaeologists remain skeptical, arguing that most of these underwater formations are natural geological features, the debate continues, and some sites remain genuinely mysterious and unexplained. If such a civilization existed, it would have been concentrated in coastal areas, taking advantage of marine resources and sea travel, which means that most of its remains would now be underwater, difficult to locate, and expensive to excavate. We are only beginning to survey the ocean floor systematically, using sonar and submersibles to map underwater topography, and it is entirely possible that major discoveries still await us beneath the waves. Even more intriguing is the evidence for massive catastrophes that occurred at the end of the Ice Age, catastrophes that could have been devastating enough to destroy entire civilizations and reset human development. Geologists have identified a period called the Younger Dryas, from approximately 10,800 to 9,600 BCE, when global temperatures suddenly plunged back to near Ice Age conditions after having begun to warm. This cold snap lasted for more than 1,000 years before temperatures rapidly increased again, marking the final end of the Ice Age. What caused the Younger Dryas has been debated for decades, with theories ranging from changes in ocean circulation to volcanic activity. But in recent years, a more dramatic theory has gained support: the impact of a comet or series of comet fragments that struck Earth, causing massive fires, floods, and a temporary return to glacial conditions. This is known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and while it remains controversial, evidence has been accumulating from sites around North America and Europe, showing a layer of sediment containing high concentrations of iridium, nanodiamonds, carbon spherules, and other markers consistent with extraterrestrial impact. If a comet impact or airburst occurred at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, it would have been catastrophic for any civilizations existing at that time, potentially triggering the floods described in mythology and causing destruction on a scale that would make the biblical flood seem like a local event. This is the kind of catastrophe that could truly erase civilizations, leaving only scattered survivors to rebuild from almost nothing. Now, before we continue with the physical evidence and the specific sites that might represent remnants of these lost civilizations, we need to pause and consider something crucial. As Enki shared forbidden knowledge with Ziusudra, warning him of the coming flood and giving him the means to survive, this channel seeks to share investigations that challenge official narratives, that ask questions mainstream institutions prefer to avoid. If you find this exploration valuable, if these questions resonate with your own sense that something is missing from the story we have been told, consider subscribing to this channel. We produce documentary investigations that delve deep into ancient mysteries, alternative history, and suppressed knowledge, always presenting multiple perspectives and encouraging critical thinking. Your subscription helps us continue this work, ensuring that these questions continue to be asked and these mysteries continue to be explored. Returning to our investigation. If the impact hypothesis is correct, then we have a mechanism for exactly the kind of catastrophic destruction that ancient texts describe. But was the Younger Dryas the only such event? Or have there been multiple catastrophic impacts and climate shifts over the past 100,000 years or more? Ice core data from Greenland and Antarctica, along with ocean sediment cores, reveal that Earth's climate has been highly unstable over the past several 100,000 years, with rapid shifts between warm and cold periods, some occurring within a human lifetime. These shifts would have forced human populations to constantly adapt, migrate, or perish. Any civilization that arose during a relatively stable warm period could have been destroyed when the climate shifted, with survivors forced to become nomadic again, losing their cities, their writing, their technology, everything that marked them as civilized. Over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, this could have happened multiple times, each time setting humanity back to nearly zero, each time requiring the long, slow climb back to civilization to begin again. Could this be what the Sumerian texts remember? What the myth of cyclical destruction and recreation is actually describing? Could our current civilization, which began approximately 5,000 to 10,000 years ago, depending on how you count, be merely the latest in a long series, the seventh according to one interpretation, with 6 others having risen and fallen before us? Let me ask you this, and I want you to really think about it. Could the interpretations we have been discussing actually align with what ancient peoples were trying to convey? Or are we projecting modern concepts onto texts that meant something entirely different to their original authors? Some researchers believe that the Sumerians and other ancient cultures preserved genuine historical memory, spanning tens of thousands of years, passed down through oral tradition and eventually written down when writing was invented. Others argue that we are reading our own anxieties and modern knowledge back into texts that were never meant as historical records. This is the fundamental divide in this entire field of research. What is your perspective? Do you think ancient myths could preserve real events from the distant past, or are they purely symbolic and theological? Share your thoughts in the comments. This is not a question with an easy answer, and hearing diverse perspectives helps us all think more deeply about these mysteries. Now let us turn our attention to some of the physical evidence that has been cited in support of the lost civilization theory. Around the world, there exist ancient structures that challenge our understanding of what ancient peoples were capable of building with the technology supposedly available to them. These structures are characterized by several features: massive stone blocks that would be difficult to move even with modern equipment, precision cutting and fitting that rivals or exceeds modern masonry, astronomical alignments that demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of celestial mechanics, and in many cases, construction dates that place them earlier than conventional chronology would expect. The Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt is perhaps the most famous example. This structure, built according to mainstream Egyptology around 2560 BCE as a tomb for Pharaoh Khufu, consists of approximately 2.3 million stone blocks averaging 2.5 tons each, with some blocks weighing up to 80 tons. The precision of its construction is remarkable. The sides of the base are aligned to true north with an error of less than 1/15 of a degree. The base forms an almost perfect square, with sides varying by less than 2 inches over a length of 756 feet, and the blocks are fitted together with gaps smaller than the width of a human hair in many places. The pyramid encodes sophisticated mathematical relationships, including pi and the golden ratio, and demonstrates knowledge of Earth's dimensions that supposedly was not known until thousands of years later. How was this achieved? Mainstream Egyptology proposes that the pyramid was built over approximately 20 years using copper tools, wooden sledges, and human labor, with tens of thousands of workers quarrying, transporting, and placing the blocks using techniques that are theorized but have never been successfully demonstrated at scale. Alternative researchers point out the difficulties with this explanation. To complete the pyramid in 20 years would require placing one block every 2.5 minutes, working 24 hours a day without breaks, a rate that seems impossible given the proposed construction methods. They also note that there is no contemporary inscription anywhere in the pyramid identifying Khufu as its builder, and that the only evidence linking Khufu to the pyramid is some painted quarry marks discovered in chambers above the king's chamber, marks whose authenticity has been questioned. Alternative theories propose that the Great Pyramid is far older than the 4th dynasty, possibly predating dynastic Egypt by thousands of years, and that it was built using advanced techniques that were later lost or forgotten. Some researchers point to water erosion patterns on the nearby Sphinx, analyzed by geologist Robert Schoch, which he argues could only have been formed by prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall, something that has not occurred in the Giza region since before 5000 BCE, suggesting that the Sphinx, and possibly the pyramids as well, date to a much earlier period when the climate was wetter. If the pyramids are indeed older than conventionally dated, then they become candidates for structures built by a previous civilization, one that possessed engineering capabilities we have only recently reacquired. The Sphinx especially has been a focus of controversy, with some researchers noting that its body shows much more erosion than its head, leading to theories that the head was recarved at a later date, possibly by dynastic Egyptians who found an already ancient statue and repurposed it, adding the pharaonic headdress and changing the face. If true, this would suggest that the original Sphinx could date back to the Ice Age, perhaps 10,000 BCE or earlier, making it a remnant of the pre-flood civilization that Egyptian texts claim ruled during the first time. Moving to South America, we find similar mysteries at the site of Tiwanaku near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia. This city, sitting at an altitude of 13,000 feet, contains massive stone structures, including the famous Gate of the Sun, carved from a single piece of andesite weighing approximately 10 tons, featuring intricate reliefs and a calendar system that some researchers argue demonstrates sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The site also includes massive H-shaped blocks weighing up to 130 tons, transported from quarries several miles away, and fitted together with metal clamps, showing engineering capabilities that seem inconsistent with the technology of the culture that supposedly built it. Conventional dating places Tiwanaku's major construction around 500 to 900 CE, but alternative researchers argue that the site could be far older, possibly predating the Inca by thousands of years. One of the most intriguing features of Tiwanaku is its relationship to Lake Titicaca. The city includes structures that appear to have been ancient harbor facilities, including docks and piers. But today, these structures are several miles from the lakeshore and at an elevation above the current water level. How could this be? Did the lake shrink over time? Or was the city built when the water level was higher, perhaps much earlier than conventionally dated? Some researchers have proposed that Tiwanaku could date to the end of the Ice Age, around 10,000 BCE, when water levels and climate patterns were very different from today. Perhaps even more mysterious are the megalithic walls at Sacsayhuaman above Cusco, Peru. These walls consist of massive limestone blocks, some weighing over 200 tons, fitted together with such precision that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them, despite the fact that the blocks have irregular, complex shapes that interlock like three-dimensional jigsaw puzzles. The Inca, who controlled this region when the Spanish arrived, denied having built these walls, claiming instead that they were built by an earlier civilization, by giants or by gods, in a time before the Inca existed. The Inca did build on top of these earlier structures, but their work is easily distinguished from the megalithic base. The Inca used smaller stones with regular shapes, while the earlier builders used massive irregular blocks that demonstrate a completely different level of engineering sophistication. Similar megalithic architecture is found at Ollantaytambo, Cusco, and other sites in the region, always forming the oldest, lowest layers, with later cultures building on top. Who were these earlier builders? When did they live? And what techniques did they use to quarry, transport, and precisely fit these enormous stones? These are questions that remain unanswered, and the answers might force us to reconsider the entire chronology of South American civilization. In Lebanon, the site of Baalbek contains some of the largest worked stones ever moved by humans. The Temple of Jupiter complex sits on a foundation platform made of enormous limestone blocks, with 3 stones in the western wall known as the Trilithon, weighing approximately 800 tons each, and another stone in the quarry nearby called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighing around 1,000 tons. These stones were cut from the quarry with incredible precision, transported a third of a mile uphill, and lifted into position in the wall, all supposedly during the Roman period around the 1st century CE. But how did the Romans accomplish this? The largest cranes in use during Roman times could lift approximately 50 to 100 tons, nowhere near the weight of these stones. Even modern cranes would struggle to lift 800-ton blocks, and the logistics of moving them would be extraordinarily complex. Alternative researchers propose that the megalithic platform at Baalbek predates the Roman temple built on top of it, that it might have been constructed by an earlier civilization that had capabilities the Romans did not possess, and that the Romans simply built their temple on this existing foundation, recognizing its sanctity and permanence. Local Lebanese tradition states that Baalbek was built by Cain, the son of Adam, before the flood, making it one of the oldest constructions in the world according to legend. Could there be truth to this legend? Could Baalbek be another remnant of a pre-flood civilization? On Easter Island, the famous Moai statues have puzzled researchers since their discovery. These enormous stone figures, some weighing up to 80 tons and standing over 30 feet tall, were carved from volcanic tuff in a quarry at Rano Raraku and transported across the island to coastal platforms called Ahu, where they were erected facing inland. The islanders who live there today are descended from Polynesian settlers who arrived around 1200 CE, and they have no memory of how the statues were made or moved, claiming that their ancestors caused the statues to walk using mana, spiritual power. The island, when discovered by Europeans in 1722, was barren and deforested, with a population of only a few thousand living in primitive conditions, completely unable to quarry, transport, or erect statues of such size. Clearly, at some point in the past, Easter Island had a more substantial population and a more developed culture capable of these engineering feats. But when? And what happened to that culture? The conventional explanation is that the island's population grew, deforested the island to provide rollers for moving the statues, exhausted the soil, and collapsed into warfare and cannibalism, a cautionary tale about environmental destruction. But some researchers question whether this is the complete story. Could Easter Island have been settled much earlier than believed? Could the statues date to a time when the island was part of a larger landmass or connected to a wider network of Pacific Island cultures with advanced maritime capabilities? The statues themselves show no weathering pattern that would allow precise dating, and radiocarbon dates from the site are notoriously problematic because they rely on dating organic material associated with the statues, not the statues themselves. In Japan, off the coast of Yonaguni Island, divers discovered in 1987 a series of underwater structures that have sparked intense debate. The Yonaguni Monument, as it is called, consists of massive stone formations that appear to show right angles, flat surfaces, steps and terraces, features that some researchers argue could only be the result of human carving. The formation lies at depths of 5 to 40 meters, suggesting that if it is artificial, it was built when sea levels were lower, possibly 10,000 years ago or more during the last ice age. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura has studied the site extensively and believes it is a man-made structure, possibly a ceremonial complex or city that was submerged as sea levels rose. Skeptics argue that the features can be explained by natural geological processes, that sandstone can fracture along plains creating flat surfaces and right angles, and that without clear evidence of tool marks or cultural artifacts, the site should be considered natural until proven otherwise. The debate continues, with both sides presenting evidence to support their views. If the Yonaguni Monument is indeed artificial, it would represent proof of a civilization that existed during the Ice Age, a civilization that was sophisticated enough to work in stone and build monumental structures, a civilization that was then drowned when the ice melted and the seas rose. It would be exactly the kind of evidence we would expect to find if the lost civilization hypothesis is correct. These sites, and many others like them, present a challenge to conventional chronology. Mainstream archaeology has explanations for all of them, explanations that fit within the accepted timeline of human development and that do not require invoking lost civilizations or advanced ancient technologies. But those explanations often strain credulity, requiring us to believe that ancient peoples, with supposedly primitive tools, accomplished engineering feats that would be difficult even today, that they possessed mathematical and astronomical knowledge far beyond what their culture supposedly understood, and that they left no written records explaining how or why they built these massive structures. Alternative researchers argue that a simpler explanation exists. These structures are remnants of earlier civilizations, civilizations that possessed advanced knowledge and engineering capabilities, civilizations that were destroyed in catastrophes and whose survivors scattered, carrying with them fragments of knowledge that they passed on to their descendants, eventually giving rise to the historical civilizations we know. This explains why civilizations like Egypt, Sumer, and the Indus Valley seem to appear suddenly with fully formed architecture, mathematics, and writing, as if they inherited this knowledge from an earlier source rather than developing it gradually over millennia. Now let us examine what the texts themselves say about this inheritance, about the knowledge that was supposedly given to humanity by the gods, by the Anunnaki, by the beings who came before. The Sumerian tablets contain lists of what they called the Mi, which translates roughly as divine decrees or cosmic principles, the fundamental rules and knowledge that governed civilization. These Mi included kingship, priesthood, writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, agriculture, music, art, law, and dozens of other elements of civilized life. According to Sumerian mythology, these Mi were not discovered or invented by humans, but were given as gifts from the gods, specifically from Enki, who was considered the god of wisdom and the keeper of knowledge. In one famous myth, the goddess Inanna travels to Enki's city of Eridu, and through trickery gets him drunk, convincing him to give her the Mi, which she then takes to her own city of Uruk, establishing it as a center of civilization. This story, like many Sumerian myths, can be read metaphorically as a tale about the transfer of power and culture between cities, but it can also be read more literally as describing how knowledge was distributed, how certain centers received instruction and education that allowed them to develop rapidly, while others remained primitive. If we take the alternative interpretation seriously, the Mi represents the transfer of technology and scientific knowledge from the Anunnaki to selected human populations, a deliberate uplift program designed to create civilized societies capable of serving the needs of these advanced beings. This would explain the sudden appearance of Sumerian civilization with all its sophistication, the rapid development of writing from nothing to complex cuneiform texts within a few centuries, and the remarkable astronomical and mathematical knowledge that the Sumerians possessed from their earliest period. Let us consider the astronomical knowledge more carefully, because this is one area where the Sumerian accomplishments seem genuinely anomalous. The Sumerians divided the circle into 360 degrees, a convention we still use today, and they based their mathematics on a sexagesimal, or base 60 system, which is why we have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. This is a strange choice for a numbering system, unless you are doing complex astronomical calculations, for which base 60 offers certain computational advantages. The Sumerians tracked the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars to shift over time, completing one full cycle approximately every 26,000 years. Detecting precession requires observations over many centuries and sophisticated record-keeping, because the shift is less than 1 degree per human lifetime. Yet the Sumerians and later the Babylonians clearly knew about precession and incorporated it into their astronomical models. They also recognized that the solar system included the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, the 5 visible planets that can be seen with the naked eye. But here is where Sitchin's controversial claims come in. He argued that Sumerian texts also describe planets beyond Saturn, specifically Uranus, Neptune, and a hypothetical planet he called Nibiru, which supposedly has a long elliptical orbit that brings it into the inner solar system every 3,600 years. Mainstream scholars reject this entirely, stating that there is no evidence the Sumerians knew about planets beyond Saturn, which requires a telescope to see, and that Sitchin's translations of the relevant texts are simply wrong. The word he translated as planet, they argue, actually refers to gods or celestial phenomena, not physical planetary bodies. Yet the debate continues, because if Sitchin were correct, if the Sumerians really did possess knowledge of the outer solar system, it would be impossible to explain without proposing either that they had telescopes, which we have no evidence for, or that they were given this information by someone who had the capability to observe these distant worlds, which brings us back to the extraterrestrial hypothesis. The Sumerian mathematical system also shows sophistication that seems disproportionate to a culture supposedly in its infancy. They understood complex geometry, algebra, and even had solutions to quadratic equations. Clay tablets found at various Mesopotamian sites show mathematical problems and solutions dealing with areas, volumes, compound interest, and astronomical calculations that would not be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. One tablet, the Plimpton 322, dating to around 1800 BCE, contains what appears to be a trigonometric table listing Pythagorean triples, numerical sets that satisfy the equation A2 plus B2 chak C2 rout, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras lived. How did Babylonian scribes know about these relationships? Were they discovered independently through trial and error, or were they taught, inherited from an earlier source that had already worked out these mathematical principles? The same question applies to their astronomical tables, which accurately predicted planetary positions, lunar eclipses, and solar eclipses using mathematical models that required sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. These accomplishments do not prove the alternative hypothesis, but they do suggest that ancient Mesopotamian culture had access to a depth of knowledge that seems inconsistent with their supposed position as one of the first civilizations emerging from primitive prehistory. Now we must address something crucial that we mentioned earlier, but have not yet fully explored: the specific purpose for which humanity was created according to the Sumerian texts. Remember I told you there was a detail that changes everything about how we interpret these records? Here it is. The texts state explicitly that humans were created to be workers, to perform labor for the gods, specifically to mine gold. The Atrahasis epic describes the rebellion of the Igigi, the minor gods who had been doing the hard labor of digging rivers and canals, and it states that humans were created to take over this work. But several texts, including ones that Sitchin translated, and that even mainstream scholars acknowledge, though they interpret differently, mention gold specifically. The question becomes, why would gods need gold? If these are spiritual, supernatural beings, what use would they have for a physical metal? This is where the alternative interpretation becomes compelling. If the Anunnaki were physical beings, extraterrestrials with advanced technology, gold would make perfect sense as a resource they would need. Gold is an excellent conductor of electricity. It does not corrode, it reflects infrared radiation, and it has applications in advanced electronics and aerospace engineering. If the Anunnaki needed gold to repair their planet's atmosphere, as Sitchin proposed, or for some other technological purpose, then creating a workforce to mine it would be a logical solution. This interpretation transforms the creation story from theology into something closer to science fiction, or perhaps science fact if we are willing to consider the possibility seriously. Humans become not the special creation of a loving deity, but the product of genetic engineering, a species designed for a specific purpose, and this reframes our entire understanding of who we are and why we exist. But let us examine the counter-arguments, because intellectual honesty requires that we present the skeptical view as thoroughly as we present the alternative theory. Critics of Sitchin point out that his translation of the word that he claims means gold is disputed, that the Sumerian word kug can mean precious or holy as well as gold, and that in context it might refer to sacred offerings or ritual purity rather than the physical metal. They also argue that the entire framing of gods needing humans to work for them makes sense within ancient Near Eastern theology without requiring extraterrestrial explanation. Ancient peoples understood life as a hierarchy of service, with humans serving kings, kings serving gods, and gods serving higher cosmic principles. The idea that humans were created to serve divine needs was a way of explaining humanity's place in the cosmic order and justifying social hierarchies and religious obligations. When ancient texts say humans must provide food and offerings to the gods, mainstream scholars interpret this as describing the temple economy, where agricultural surplus was dedicated to religious institutions, not as implying that supernatural beings actually consumed physical food. Similarly, when texts describe gods residing in temples or coming down from heaven, this is understood as poetic and theological language, not as literal descriptions of physical beings traveling in vehicles. The problem with the alternative interpretation, according to this view, is that it commits a category error, treating religious and mythological texts as if they were scientific or historical documents when they were never meant to be read that way. Ancient peoples thought differently than we do. Their texts served different purposes, and imposing our modern materialistic framework on their symbolic and spiritual narratives distorts their meaning. This criticism is valid and must be taken seriously. However, alternative researchers counter that we should not assume ancient peoples were incapable of describing real events simply because they described them in religious language. If extraterrestrial beings appeared to ancient humans who had no concept of space travel or advanced technology, how else would those humans describe what they saw except in terms of gods, magic, and divine power? The religious framework might be the only available vocabulary for describing technological phenomena. When ancient texts describe gods flying in celestial boats or divine birds, perhaps they were describing actual flying vehicles, but had no technical terms for such things. When they describe weapons that could destroy cities with fire from heaven, perhaps they were describing advanced weaponry, but could only describe it in terms available to them. This is called the ancient astronaut theory in its most general form, and it proposes that many myths and religious traditions around the world preserve memories of contact between ancient humans and technologically advanced extraterrestrials. Contact that was interpreted through religious and mythological frameworks because those were the only frameworks available. The theory does not require that every myth or every god represents alien contact, only that some core historical events involving such contact were preserved and then elaborated upon through centuries of retelling until they became the complex mythological systems we study today. This is testable in principle. If the ancient astronaut hypothesis is correct, we should find certain patterns in ancient texts and physical remains that are difficult to explain conventionally, but make sense if advanced beings interacted with ancient humans. What patterns would we expect to find? First, descriptions of flying vehicles or beings descending from the sky, which we do find in numerous traditions, the vimanas of Hindu texts, the flying wheels of Ezekiel in the Bible, the fire chariots of various mythologies. Second, descriptions of advanced weapons and their effects, which again we find the Brahmastra of Indian epics that could destroy entire armies and create lasting contamination, the thunderbolts of Zeus, the fire from heaven that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Third, accounts of beings with superior knowledge teaching humans various arts and sciences, which is a universal mythological theme. The 7 sages of Sumer, the culture heroes of Native American traditions, Prometheus bringing fire, Quetzalcoatl, teaching civilization to the Mesoamericans, the Watchers in the Book of Enoch teaching humanity forbidden knowledge. Fourth, stories of hybrid beings resulting from gods mating with humans, which we find in the Nephilim of Genesis, the demigods of Greek mythology, the royal bloodlines of Egypt and Mesopotamia that claimed descent from gods. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, we would expect to find physical evidence of knowledge or technology that seems out of place for the time period, what are called out-of-place artifacts or anachronisms. Do we find such evidence? The answer is contested, with mainstream archaeology explaining most supposed anachronisms as misunderstandings or hoaxes, but with enough genuine puzzles remaining that the question cannot be dismissed entirely. Consider the Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901. This device, dating to approximately 100 BCE, is a complex mechanical computer with at least 30 bronze gears that could calculate the positions of the sun, moon and planets, predict eclipses and track the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games. It is far more sophisticated than any other known artifact from the ancient world, and nothing comparable appears in the historical record until medieval astronomical clocks more than 1,000 years later. When it was first discovered, its significance was not recognized, but modern X-ray imaging and computer modeling have revealed its extraordinary complexity. How did the Greeks of the Hellenistic period possess the knowledge and skill to build such a device? Were there other similar machines that did not survive? Or does this represent the tail end of a much longer tradition of mechanical engineering that we know almost nothing about because most artifacts were lost or destroyed? The Antikythera mechanism proves that ancient peoples could achieve technological sophistication far beyond what we normally credit them with, and it raises the question of what else they might have been capable of that has not survived. Another intriguing anomaly is the Baghdad battery, a clay jar discovered in Iraq dating to around 250 BCE that contained a copper cylinder surrounding an iron rod, components that when filled with an acidic liquid could generate a small electric current. Archaeologists debate whether this was actually used as a battery or had some other purpose such as holding sacred scrolls, but experiments have shown that it could function as a simple galvanic cell producing approximately 1 volt. If ancient Mesopotamians understood electricity, even in a rudimentary form, what else might they have understood about physics and chemistry? We know that ancient metallurgists achieved remarkable results in creating steel, bronze, brass, and other alloys long before the scientific principles underlying metallurgy were formally understood in modern terms. We know that ancient chemists created cement, glass, dyes, and medicines, using processes that required sophisticated knowledge of chemistry, even if they did not describe it using modern chemical nomenclature. Ancient technology was different from modern technology, often based on different principles and achieving different goals, but it was not necessarily less sophisticated, just less well preserved and less well understood by modern researchers. The same applies to ancient construction techniques. We assume that because ancient peoples did not have steel tools, gasoline engines, or electrical equipment, they must have been limited in what they could build. But this assumption may be wrong. Ancient engineers achieved results that we struggle to replicate even with modern equipment, suggesting that they had techniques and knowledge that we have lost. The precision cutting of massive granite blocks in Egypt, the massive transport of multi-ton stones over long distances in South America and Lebanon, the precise astronomical alignments of structures around the world, these accomplishments suggest capabilities that we do not fully understand. Some researchers have proposed that ancient builders used sound, specifically resonant frequencies, to soften or levitate stone, making it easier to cut and move. This idea seems far-fetched until you learn that modern scientists have successfully used acoustic levitation to lift small objects using nothing but focused sound waves, and that various ancient traditions speak of priests and magicians moving stones using sound, chanting, or musical instruments. The Egyptians told Herodotus that priests could command stones to move through the power of their voices. Inca legends speak of stones that were softened like clay through the application of plant extracts, allowing them to be shaped by hand before hardening again. Are these stories pure fantasy? Or could they preserve distorted memories of actual techniques that involve principles of physics we have not yet rediscovered? But even if we accept that ancient peoples were more technologically capable than conventionally believed, this does not necessarily support the lost civilization or ancient astronaut hypotheses. Skeptics argue that all these accomplishments can be explained as the achievements of the known historical civilizations, that we do not need to invoke earlier unknown civilizations or extraterrestrial intervention to explain pyramids, megalithic structures, or sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Ancient humans were just as intelligent as modern humans. They had thousands of years to develop techniques and accumulate knowledge, and the fact that we do not fully understand how they accomplished certain feats says more about our ignorance than about their need for outside help. This is a fair point, and it reminds us that we should not underestimate ancient peoples or assume that anything impressive must have required superhuman or alien assistance. However, the question remains, if all these civilizations developed independently, why do they show such remarkable similarities? Why do cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other build similar structures, have similar myths, practice similar astronomical observations, and claim that their knowledge came from gods who descended from the heavens? Is this all coincidence? Or is there a common source, either a lost civilization that influenced later cultures, or direct intervention by some external agency that provided knowledge and guidance to multiple cultures around the world? This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of comparative mythology, the flood myth. The story of a great flood that destroyed most of humanity appears in cultures around the world, from Mesopotamia to India, from Greece to Central America, from China to indigenous Australia. The similarities between these stories are striking. A warning given to one righteous person or family, the construction of a boat to survive the deluge, the saving of animals or seeds to preserve life, the receding of waters and the landing on a mountain, the offering of sacrifices to appease the gods, and the promise that such destruction would not be repeated or would be delayed. In the Near East we have multiple versions of this story: the Sumerian flood myth with Ziusudra, the Babylonian Atrahasis, and Gilgamesh epics with Utnapishtim, the biblical story of Noah in Genesis. In India, the Matsya Purana tells of Manu being warned by a fish avatar of Vishnu about a coming flood, and building a boat to save himself and the 7 rishis, along with seeds of all plants. In Greek mythology, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a flood sent by Zeus to punish humanity, landing on Mount Parnassus and repopulating the earth. In Chinese tradition, the Great Flood required the efforts of multiple heroes over generations to control, with Yu the Great finally succeeding in draining the waters through massive engineering projects. Mesoamerican and South American traditions speak of multiple floods and cataclysms that destroyed earlier ages of humanity. Are all these stories describing the same event? Or were there multiple catastrophic floods at different times in different regions? Or is the flood story a mythological archetype that emerges naturally from the human psyche, perhaps inspired by local flooding events that were then universalized into cosmic narratives? Geologists have identified evidence for massive flooding events at the end of the last ice age, floods that would have been truly catastrophic for any peoples living in affected regions. When ice dams holding back glacial lakes burst, the resulting floods could dwarf anything in recorded history, releasing volumes of water that would submerge entire valleys in minutes and create massive tsunamis in coastal regions. The Missoula floods in North America, where glacial Lake Missoula repeatedly burst through its ice dam and drained across what is now Washington state, created temporary waterfalls larger than all the current waterfalls on Earth combined and scoured out the Columbia River Gorge. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis proposes that around 5600 BCE, the Mediterranean Sea broke through a natural dam at the Bosphorus and flooded the Black Sea basin, which had been a freshwater lake at a much lower level, drowning a large inhabited area and possibly creating the flood memory preserved in Middle Eastern traditions. If the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is correct, then the melting of ice and the resulting floods at the end of the Ice Age would have been sudden and catastrophic, potentially drowning coastal civilizations around the world within the span of decades or even years. These are real events, documented in the geological record, and they occurred within the time frame of human habitation, so it is entirely plausible that memories of these floods were preserved in oral tradition and eventually written down as the flood myths we find in ancient texts. But here is the crucial question. If these floods destroyed advanced civilizations, civilizations that had reached levels of development we consider characteristic of civilization, temples, cities, agriculture, writing, then those civilizations should appear in the archaeological record from before the floods. Where are they? This is the challenge that conventional archaeology poses to the lost civilization hypothesis. Show us the evidence. Show us the cities, the tools, the pottery, the undeniable artifacts that prove these civilizations existed. The lack of such evidence, according to mainstream scholars, is not because we have not looked, not because it is all underwater or destroyed, but because these civilizations never existed in the first place. Human civilization developed exactly as the archaeological record shows. Starting with the Neolithic Revolution around 10,000 BCE, progressing through various stages of increasing complexity, and culminating in the first cities and states around 3500 BCE in Mesopotamia and shortly afterward in Egypt, India, and China. Everything before this was prehistory, peopled by hunter-gatherers and early farmers who lived in small villages, without cities, states, writing, or the other markers of civilization. This narrative is not based on absence of evidence, but on extensive evidence from thousands of archaeological sites around the world that have been excavated, studied, and dated using multiple methods. To overturn this consensus requires not speculation, but concrete evidence, artifacts and sites that can be examined and verified independently. Until such evidence is produced, the lost civilization hypothesis remains an interesting speculation, but not a scientifically supported theory. This is the position of mainstream archaeology, and it is based on rigorous standards of evidence and methodology that have been developed over more than a century of archaeological practice. However, alternative researchers respond that the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, especially when we consider how much of the ancient world remains unexplored. We have surveyed perhaps 1% of the ocean floor in detail, meaning that vast areas of submerged continental shelf, areas that were above water during the Ice Age and could have supported civilizations, have never been examined. We have excavated only a tiny fraction of known archaeological sites, with most major sites having only portions exposed while the bulk remains buried. Entire ancient cities are still being discovered regularly, such as the massive city recently found beneath the jungle canopy in Honduras, using LiDAR technology, or the numerous sites being identified through satellite imagery in formerly unexplored regions. Each new discovery pushes back dates or reveals unexpected sophistication. Göbekli Tepe pushed back monumental architecture by thousands of years. Sites in the Amazon have revealed that what was thought to be pristine rainforest was actually managed landscape with large populations and complex societies. Submerged cities off the coast of India have shown that urban development occurred earlier than conventionally believed in South Asia. The archaeological picture is constantly being revised as new evidence comes to light, and what seems impossible today based on current evidence might become accepted tomorrow when new discoveries are made. Given this reality, is it not premature to declare definitively that no lost civilizations could exist simply because we have not yet found unambiguous evidence for them. Let me ask you another question, one that goes to the heart of this entire investigation. What would convince you that the lost civilization theory is correct? What specific evidence would you need to see? And conversely, what would convince you that it is wrong? These are not rhetorical questions. They help us understand our own biases and assumptions, the criteria we use to evaluate claims and evidence. If you find that no evidence could possibly convince you one way or the other, then you have moved from rational inquiry into the realm of faith, either faith that the conventional narrative must be correct or faith that alternative theories must be correct. True inquiry requires being open to persuasion by evidence while maintaining rigorous standards for what constitutes valid evidence. This is not easy, because we all have cognitive biases that affect how we interpret information, but it is necessary if we want to arrive at something approaching truth rather than just defending our pre-existing beliefs. So consider carefully, what would change your mind? Share your thoughts in the comments, because this kind of meta-discussion about how we know what we know is as important as the specific content we are examining. Let us now turn to another line of evidence that alternative researchers find compelling. Ancient texts that describe events or beings in ways that seem to match modern scientific knowledge, knowledge that ancient peoples supposedly should not have possessed. This is sometimes called the ancient knowledge argument, and it takes several forms. First, there are texts that describe cosmic or geological events with accuracy that seems impossible for the time period. The Hindu Vedas, composed between 1500 and 500 BCE according to conventional dating, but possibly much older according to some scholars, contain descriptions of cosmic cycles lasting billions of years, numbers that align surprisingly well with modern calculations of the age of the universe and the lifespan of stars. The Vedas also describe the universe as expanding and contracting in cycles, remarkably similar to modern cosmological models of the Big Bang and potential Big Crunch. Are these coincidences? Or did ancient Indian sages possess knowledge of cosmology that modern science has only recently rediscovered? The Jain texts of India describe multiple categories of living beings based on the number of senses they possess, from one-sensed beings like plants and microorganisms to five-sensed beings like humans and animals, showing a systematic understanding of biology that predates modern taxonomy. Ancient Chinese texts describe earthquakes as resulting from movements in the earth itself, anticipating plate tectonics, and they recorded sunspots centuries before European astronomers acknowledged them. Second, there are descriptions of advanced medical procedures and anatomical knowledge that seem ahead of their time. The Sushruta Samhita, an ancient Sanskrit text on medicine and surgery, dated to around 600 BCE, but possibly based on much older sources, describes hundreds of surgical procedures including cataract surgery, plastic surgery, and caesarean sections, along with detailed anatomical descriptions and classifications of diseases. The Edwin Smith Papyrus from ancient Egypt, dating to around 1600 BCE but copying material from much earlier sources, contains detailed descriptions of brain injuries, spinal injuries, and their effects, showing knowledge of neuroanatomy that would not be rediscovered in the West until modern times. How did ancient physicians acquire this knowledge without modern imaging technology or the ability to perform systematic dissections? Did they experiment extensively on living subjects? Or did they inherit medical knowledge from an earlier source that had already worked out these principles? The Hippocratic corpus from ancient Greece demonstrates understanding of disease causes, the importance of hygiene and treatment protocols that seem remarkably modern in their approach, rejecting supernatural explanations in favor of natural causes and rational treatment. Third, and perhaps most intriguingly, there are descriptions in ancient texts of what sound like advanced technology described in archaic terms. We have already mentioned the Vimanas of Hindu literature, flying vehicles described in texts like the Vaimanika Shastra and the Ramayana, which supposedly could travel great distances, even to other planets, and were powered by some form of mercury-based propulsion system. Mainstream scholars classify these texts as medieval forgeries or imaginative fiction, But some researchers take them more seriously, noting that the descriptions include technical details about construction, materials, and flight characteristics that seem oddly specific for pure invention. The Mahabharata, one of the two great Sanskrit epics, describes a war between kingdoms that deployed advanced weapons capable of mass destruction. The Brahmastra, a particularly devastating weapon, is described as producing a flash brighter than the sun, creating a mushroom-shaped column of smoke and fire, killing warriors instantly and causing survivors to lose their hair and nails, with the land remaining contaminated and barren for years afterward. These descriptions have led some researchers to suggest that the Mahabharata preserves memories of ancient nuclear warfare, that at some point in the distant past, a civilization possessed atomic weapons and used them in battle, with catastrophic results. Mainstream scholars reject this interpretation entirely, arguing that the descriptions are poetic exaggeration, that they can be explained as describing natural disasters like volcanic eruptions or meteor impacts, or that they are purely mythological with no historical basis whatsoever. Fourth, there are ancient maps that seem to show geographical knowledge that should not have existed at the time they were drawn. The Piri Reis map, created by Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis in 1513, shows the coastlines of Europe, Africa, and South America with remarkable accuracy, and some researchers claim it also shows the coast of Antarctica without its ice cover, suggesting the map was based on much older source maps created when Antarctica was not glaciated, which would place them before the end of the last ice age, more than 10,000 years ago. The Orontius Phineus map from 1531 also purportedly shows Antarctica in accurate detail with rivers and mountains that are now under ice. Conventional cartographers dispute these interpretations, arguing that what appears to be Antarctica is actually a misdrawn South America or a speculative continent placed in the Southern Ocean based on the ancient theory that there must be a southern landmass to balance the northern continents, and that the apparent accuracy is coincidental or the result of viewing the maps selectively. The debate over these maps continues, with each side accusing the other of seeing what they want to see rather than what the evidence actually shows. But if the alternative interpretation were correct, if these maps really do show Antarctica without ice, it would prove definitively that a civilization existed during the Ice Age with the maritime capability and geographical knowledge to survey the entire world, a civilization that has left almost no other trace of its existence. We are now approximately 1/3 of the way through our investigation, and already the picture that emerges is complex and ambiguous. We have ancient texts that describe creation, catastrophes, and cycles of civilizations. We have megalithic structures that demonstrate engineering capabilities that seem inconsistent with primitive technology. We have myths and legends from around the world that show striking similarities, suggesting either common origin or common influence. We have suggestive but not conclusive evidence for knowledge and technology that seems ahead of its time. And we have a small but growing body of physical evidence, from underwater structures to genetic anomalies to geological markers of catastrophic events, that challenges the conventional timeline. But we also have mainstream explanations for all of these phenomena, explanations that do not require lost civilizations or ancient astronauts, explanations that fit within the established scientific framework. The question is not whether strange and anomalous things exist in the historical record. Clearly they do. The question is how we interpret those anomalies, whether we incorporate them into an expanded understanding of ancient history, or whether we explain them away as coincidence, misunderstanding, or fraud. This is not a question that can be answered definitively at present. It requires more research, more excavation, more analysis of existing evidence, and most importantly, more willingness to ask uncomfortable questions and challenge established narratives. As we move forward, we will explore even more specific evidence and theories, always maintaining the balance between open-minded inquiry and rigorous skepticism, always presenting multiple perspectives, and always encouraging you to think critically and draw your own conclusions.